Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 120 Beyond. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session. And for this episode, I think the subject matter for this recording is related to material that is probably familiar only to long-time fans of Captain Canuck. More specifically, those who read the original run of Captain Canuck comics in the late 70s and early 80s. This is actually a topic I've been meaning to cover on the show for at least a couple of years now. It was back in 2016 that I went to Word on the Street, the festival at Harborfront Center, and Chapter House Comics had a table set up there, and they made a pretty large purchase from the good folks at Chapter House, and they ended up giving me the collected edition of Beyond, the quest for Miden, for free. And I had some familiarity with the existence of this story, which originally appeared as a backup feature in the original Captain Canuck comics. But because I only read the original Captain Canuck run in the IDW and later Chapter House compendium, I only knew that Beyond was a sword and sorcery type story. And so I took the collected edition home and put it away and said, okay, well, one day I'll cover it on the show. And then, wow, how time passes us by so quickly. And I've been doing some cleaning out recently in my home, moving different things out, creating more space. And wow, I need to create a lot more space given what's coming up in the months ahead for me. But stay tuned for a special announcement which will probably come your way in a week or so. But getting back to this current recording, as I was clearing things out, I was going through my long boxes. I pulled out my collected edition of Beyond, and I said, okay, it's time that I covered this. It's great because it's Canadian content. It's also something which I would say is considered pretty obscure compared to most other comic stories which are covered on this and other podcasts. And it's nice when I get to go back to my original mandate to look at stories from yesteryear that don't get their due coverage on most other shows. And I actually really enjoyed reading this collected edition. So broad spoilers ahead for Beyond. In the collected form, this works out to a really nice, roughly 64-page trade paperback. I'm going to be talking about the genesis, the origins of the Beyond backup feature. I'll give you a general synopsis of what Beyond is about without getting into any really deep page-by-page, panel-by-panel spoilers. I'll tell you what I really enjoyed about Beyond. It's also a really neat story, just looking at how the creative credits changed on Beyond, because this is something which lasted for only a few chapters. Of course, because the original run of Captain Canuck was cancelled rather abruptly in the early 1980s, Beyond was also cancelled without it receiving a proper ending. And so it's really nice that the original creators are able to come back in more recent times and give a nice conclusion to this first arc, but set things up for future Beyond stories in years to come. Alright, so let's get into this. In the collected edition, on the inside cover, there's a really neat map showing you the world of Beyond. I'm guessing this is somewhere in the eastern hemisphere, but you see that there are a lot of different provinces and territories. Some really neat names which are thrown in there, like George Inlet, reference to George Freeman, Fadi Island, a shout out to Fadi Hakim from Chapter House Comics. Just a really nice way of visualizing where exactly the story takes place. There's also a really great foreword by Richard Cumley, where he talks about how this story came to be created. And so I'm really working off the foreword which he gives for this, since the only way that I knew about Beyond prior to reading this collected edition was seeing little snippets, little advertisements that make their way into the reprinted or trade collections that were put out by IDW and Chapter House, featuring the main Captain Canuck feature in the original run. Now first, Beyond was not the first and only backup feature included in the original Captain Canuck run. I was aware of the existence of the first backup feature, which was called John. That's because, of course, I have the first issue of the original Captain Canuck run, signed by Richard Cumley, no less. And so from that I know that John, which I want to say was put together primarily by George Freeman, it was a John Carter type story. There was also a Catman backup feature which appeared in issues 4 and 6, and I think DC Comics and other comics companies weren't too happy with Cumley Comics' choice of the name Catman for this character. So when the character was revived briefly for the Captain Canuck Unholy War series, the character was renamed Splatter. And then there was one other backup story that I was reading about a while ago, and I'm afraid I can't remember the name of it, but it appeared only once in issue number 5. But according to the foreword by Mr. Richard Cumley, the co-creator of Captain Canuck, he explains that Jean-Claude Saint-Aubin, better known today simply as Claude Saint-Aubin, and George Freeman came to Mr. Cumley and said, we need to have another backup feature in Captain Canuck. And they had plans for the sword and sorcery tale, and so they gave the pitch to Mr. Cumley, and because he had been working so closely with these two men for a few years now, he really bought into their idea of Beyond and said, okay, I'm coming on board for it. And in fact, he was the initial scripter for the series, while Mr. Freeman and Saint-Aubin provided the art. By the midway point, or towards the end of this, no, more the midway point, the creative credits changed to read script by the crew, meaning that it reached a point where all three men were contributing equally to the story. And Beyond ran in issues 9, 10, 11, and 12. And yeah, it was issue number 12 where credits read the crew, because Mr. Cumley says that, quote, all three of us were unitedly vested in crafting the story. And now there was there were another 2 chapters which were written, and the last one which saw print during the original run was issue number 14. Now, there was another chapter which was written, and the art was prepared, and that would have appeared in Captain Canuck number 15, but of course the original run of Canuck was cancelled with issue number 14. And over the years, Mr. Comley would, after having the rights to Captain Canuck returned to him, print a limited number of copies of issue number 15 for people who were close to him. So there were a small number of readers who actually got to see what turned out to be the final chapter of Beyond. But for everybody else, this last chapter would not appear until the collected edition of Beyond was released in 2015. And even then, readers could see that this wasn't the concluding chapter to Beyond. There's actually plans to keep the story going, but things unfortunately ended where they did. The really nice thing, though, with the collected edition is that the original three creators, Mr. Saint-Aubin, Freeman, and Comley, came back together. Or actually, sorry, I need to correct myself. It was Mr. Freeman and Comley who came together to produce a 7th chapter, which wrapped up what would be considered the first arc, while setting things up for another arc, which hopefully we'll see in years to come. No word on why Mr. Saint-Aubin was not on this. Maybe he was involved in some way, and decision was made not to have him included on the credits. Something I might like to investigate in the future. As I mentioned earlier, the creative credits did change, rotate. There was one addition to the creative team, but I'll talk about that more after I go through a synopsis of Beyond. So the story begins with the introduction of 3 survivors of the disappearance of the village of Medan. We're introduced to Fen, very attractive, blonde-haired young woman. She discovers over the course of the series that she has the ability to transform herself into, I'd say, a light-based being. And she's considerably powerful in that form. And it's left to the reader to read forward and to consider how it is that she's able to transform herself in such a way. Even Fen herself doesn't understand how she's able to go through this transformation, which seemingly is something which she can do at will. We're also introduced to Ryan, and he is an Elricon. He looks like a hybrid deer man. He's got human male face and hands, but his lower legs, his feet, are clearly not human. He's got pointed ears. He's got smaller antlers coming out from his hair at the top of his head. And he's somebody who's very loyal to his friends. He doesn't appear especially strong physically, but he is strong of heart. We're also introduced to Lady Elodil. She is the 3rd survivor of the disappearance of Medan, and she is a brave warrior woman, very noble, excellent hand-to-hand combatant, excellent at wielding a sword. She goes through a change in her look midway through the series. Early on in the series, she has more of like a mohawk type look. And she has a darker complexion, except the upper